Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Freeston, Director of Quality Improvement at the Preschool Learning Alliance, and I'm joined today by Shannon Hawthorne, Press and Public Affairs Director.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us.
Today's topic is an update on the early years funding and delivery changes. Many of you will recall that we did an original session back in October at the time when the consultation on the early years national funding formula was just underway. And Shannon has kindly come back to give us an update on the outcomes of that consultation and what we expect to come into place by March, April of this year. Without further ado, I will just take you through the structure of today, and then I will hand over to Shannon. First of all, I need to make sure that you can see my screen. Can everybody, please put your hand down from the previous question, can everybody see that slide on the structure of the session? Good, smashing, thank you. For those of you who are new to webinars, don't panic. They're very similar to normal seminars, but they're on the web, which is a fantastic way of us reaching far more people than we could fit into a training room at any one particular time. We normally work to a situation of about a 15 to 20 minute presentation. Experience of the funding formula means we normally break our own rules on 20 minutes and we go slightly longer than that. Shannon's nodding. And then we also structure it that we have time for questions and comments. But as I always say to people, these sessions work best as a dialogue, as if you were in the room in front of us. If you feel you have a question at any time, do please type it into the box, and I'll talk you through that in a second, because my role as chair is to try and weave those seamlessly or bluntly into Shannon's slides as we talk through, because this topic does raise as many questions as it answers, so don't please wait to the end. You should have this control panel in front of you, hopefully that's the case. And if you have a question, just type it into the box and that then gets sent through to me. Don't worry, I'm the only person who can see it. It doesn't go to everybody else who's registered. So if you feel as though it's a rather simplistic question, you won't be identified. And I suppose I would stress on this particular topic, there are no such thing as dumb questions. Anything is a sensible question because it is a very technical situation. Without further ado, I shall hand over to Shannon, and I look forward to receiving your questions.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you everyone for joining. As Michael said, we ran a webinar last year on early years funding changes when the consultation on funding changes was published by government. The response to that consultation has now been published. That was published in December. And in November as well, the government also published its response to the consultation on delivery, early years delivery model. So this is going to look at both, not just funding, it's going to look at funding and delivery changes and a bit of an update. As Michael warned, it's a complicated subtopic, so I may well significantly break the 20-minute limit, but hopefully you'll find it informative and interesting. Do ask any questions. Hopefully I have the answers. If I don't, I can take them back with me to DFE and come back to you separately. So to start, looking at the funding formula that was proposed last year. So in August last year, the government published a consultation paper on a new early years national funding formula, and it looked at three main areas: how money gets from central government to local authorities, how money gets from local authorities to providers, and additional support for special educational needs and disabilities provision. So the early years national funding formula looks, as you can see hopefully on your screen, and the government has now confirmed that it is going ahead with this formula. So just to summarise, this formula is how the government calculates how much money each local authority in England receives from the central government, and that amount is adjusted to take into account two main factors: how many children in the area have additional needs, and how expensive it is for providers to operate in that area.
Based on the expenses in the local area based on?
Oh, staff costs and premises costs. So essentially, early years national funding formula works as is on your screen. So local authorities all start from the same starting point, which is £3.53 per hour. This is just a starting point from the formula to work from. No local authority, and we'll get into this in more detail, actually receives £3.53 an hour in funding. I did have a call from a provider this week saying they've been told their local authority is getting £3.53, and I can only presume someone had seen the formula and how it works and gotten confused. So the calculation starts from £3.53. Extra funding is then added in to reflect additional needs, and then that total is multiplied by an area cost adjustment to give the final hourly rate. Now, that is a quick overview because there is so much more information to get through. So there is a lot more information on the specific detail of how the early years national funding formula works and how the figures have been reached. But because we've had a webinar on that in detail before and we've got so much more to get through and not that much time, I think it's best to refer anyone that didn't join us for the past webinar to that webinar. And if you just go to our YouTube channel, which is the URL is down the bottom of your screen hopefully, and click on webinars, there's a lot more information about how it's calculated, the rate for local authorities, because what we're going to focus on today is how provider rates are calculated, because we didn't have that information in such detail before. And I think really for those listening to this webinar, that's probably the priority.
I remember my reaction, whilst it might not be rocket science, it certainly required a good statistical understanding and knowledge of your local area. It was very involved. I was surprised.
So if you do want to know more about how the local authority rate has been calculated, do please check that out. But we'll move on for today to get onto providers as quickly as possible. One thing that changed when the government published its response to the consultation is that it announced that it was introducing a minimum funding rate for local authorities. So in the original proposal for the earliest national funding formula, when you plugged that formula in and put the numbers through it, the lowest local authority rate from central government was £3.78. And there are about a third of local authorities that were due to receive less than £4.30 per hour. The government decided as a result of the consultation to put in £30 million more funding to increase the minimum rate for local authorities for £4.30 an hour. So this means that no local authority will receive less than £4.30 an hour from government in April. It's really important to note, and that's why it's in red and in bold, that this applies to local authorities, not providers. This minimum rate is a minimum local authority rate. We'll get onto the provider rates shortly.
Can I ask a question then? So does that mean they changed the base rate from which they do the calculation,
No.
or have they changed, if the calculation comes out below £4.30, they raise it to £4.30?
So the calculation will work as it does. If the calculation brings the total figure for the local authority to £3.99, it would just get raised to £4.30 regardless of what the figure was.
Right.
That's correct. Thank you, Michael. So previously the government had said that 75% of local authorities were going to see their rate increase as a result of this new national funding formula. With the introduction of the minimum funding rate, it's now 80% of local authorities that will see their rate increase. Of course, that means that 20% are still seeing their rate decrease. And as Michael says, for all local authorities, that same formula with the same starting point is used. However, for some local authorities, when you use this formula, their rate drops a significant amount. And to try and mitigate the impact of that, the government has put in a limit to how much a local authority's rate can fall compared to last year, so 2016-17. So that limit is 10% over 2 years, so 5% this coming year from April 2017 and 5% from 2018. That's called a funding floor. So if you hear about 10% funding floor, that's what that's referring to. So, in addition to money coming through that national funding formula, so that's money that all local authorities will receive, although they'll receive different amounts, depending on how the formula works for them. There are other streams of funding that some local authorities receive, some might not, some will receive more than others. So the top one you can see there is one that we all know about, is the earliest pupil premium. So the earliest pupil premium is continuing, as has been the case for local authorities. It sits outside the funding formula. If you're confused why it says 5p an hour, that is the average rate. If you average the amount being spent on the pupil premium across all the hours delivered by all local authorities. So that's how much it would add to an average rate. Obviously, in different areas, more children are eligible for the earliest pupil premium than others, so it won't work out as 5p an hour. So that's just an overall average. Maintained nursery school funding, as we'll get on to, maintained nursery schools are likely to be seeing a decrease in funding with the new formula. So the government has pledged £55 million in funding per year to help them transition onto the new funding system. And again, if you spread that across all local authorities, across all the hours offered, that works out on average £9 per hour. Disability access funding, again, something we'll come on to a bit later in a bit more detail, but essentially that's £12.5 million per year of funding to support providers to make adjustments needed to support disabled children's access in their care. And if you average that out, it comes to 2p per hour. And mystery quality and expertise funding, which the government just completely refuses to provide any more information on, other than its funding to utilise the quality and expertise that exists in the system and give additional support to disadvantaged areas. That's £5 million funding a year. It works out about an extra penny an hour if you spread it across everyone, although not everyone will get it. And that's 4 sources of funding that sit outside the national funding formula that some local authorities might get, some might not. Some will get more than the others. Previously, when you added all of that to the average amount of funding going to local authorities, it came to £4.88. And that's where the £4.88 figure that DfE bandied about came from. Because the new minimum funding rate has been introduced, that average figure has increased slightly. So it's now £4.94 on average that local authorities will receive from government. If you strip out all those extra bits of funding and you're only looking at money that goes through the earliest national funding formula, it's £4.77 per hour on average. Now, as you know, different local authorities are receiving different amounts of money, so not all local authorities will receive £4.77, and not all local authorities receive £4.94 when you add in the extra streams, but that is the average funding rate.
Cool, thank you. Just drawing breath on that. There's a question from Sarah, and it relates to the previous slide before you on. Do we know which 20% of local authorities are expecting to get less money?
We can find out, and we have a list online of what local authorities are getting. So the government has produced the most horrendous spreadsheet you've ever seen in your life that has details on which local authorities are getting which amounts of money. They have a column that says this is how much they got last year, and they have a column that says this is how much they're getting this year, amongst about 20 more columns. So it's not too complicated to find out which ones have decreased, increased, and by how much. If you did want that provided, please feel free to email feedback@free-school.org.uk. Just pop me an email and I can put something together on that quite quickly. So it's not something we have in front of us, but it's something that can be compiled very quickly.
And presumably all the local authorities got notified towards the end of December, so they know their situation. So if you have good contacts into your particular local authority, you'll be able to find out by asking any questions.
All local authorities now know what funding they're getting from government next year, or this year, April, next financial year. So next on to the big bit is how funding gets from local authorities to providers. So the first point to be really clear on is that there are still going to be single funding formulas used locally. So the national funding formula doesn't replace single funding formulas. The national funding formula is about how money gets from central government to local authorities. Local authorities will still use a single funding formula, i.e. base rates plus supplements, to fund local providers. There are some changes. These are the changes that were previously proposed by government, and they're continuing with them, so you might be aware of these already. First of all, from 2019-20, there's going to be a universal base rate, so all local authorities will be required to give all providers in their area, regardless of if they're PBI, maintained, childminders, have a certain amount of children, they all have to have the same base rate. Supplements can still vary, but they have to have the same base rate. Local authorities will be encouraged to move to a universal base rate sooner, but they don't have to until 2019-20. Central spend, so the money that local authorities receive from government, historically many have not passed all of it on to providers. They've retained some for administrative costs or the cost of an early years support officer, and it varied massively. In inner London there were some that were retaining over a fifth of the funding they received. Government has now put a maximum on this, so local authorities can hold back a maximum of 7% of the funding they receive from government as of this April, and as of next April that will drop to 5%. The government also identified that the amount of money that local authorities channeled through supplements as opposed to the base rate varied widely. So they've now limited this to what they said was the average amount across all local authorities, which is 10%. So 90% of funding has to go through the base rate and 10% to go through supplements. And the government also identified that there are a whole range of very complicated and very varying different supplements being used by various local authorities. So it has now limited the amount and number of supplements that local authorities can use, which I'm going to go into in the next slide. So we have 5 proposed supplement types. The first, which is probably familiar to all of you, is deprivation. So that's funding to reflect the higher cost of delivering care and education to children from more deprived backgrounds. Deprivation is the only supplement that will be compulsory. Rurality and sparsity is reflecting the fact that providers in rural and sparsely populated areas can struggle to attract demand and exploit economies of scale, so that's extra funding for those. Flexibility is to encourage flexible provision, for example, holiday care, wraparound care, out of hours. And there were 2 supplements that had been proposed. Efficiency, which was to encourage providers to exploit the scope of efficiency, and delivery of 30 hours, which is to encourage providers to deliver 30 hours, both of which I'm proud to say that the Alliance opposed, and both of which have now been scrapped. The 30 hours supplement is something the government said they are keeping under review, but for now it has been scrapped. And 2 new supplements have been approved in their place. So quality, which is either qualifications or what is called system leadership, which is high quality settings being rewarded for supporting other providers in areas of disadvantage, and or brokering structural solutions to meet parents' patterns of demand with a consistently high quality offer. Your guess is as good as mine. The key thing on quality is it's not frosted. So if you previously received a quality supplement because you had a good or outstanding Ofsted, that is no longer allowed under the new supplement guidelines. And the additional supplement that has been added in as a result of the consultation is English as an additional language, so to reflect the number of children speaking English as an additional language and the additional cost associated.
Okay, just before we move on, I had a couple of questions which I think are covering the same thing. Lorna and Chris. Lorna first, and it's back to the supplements, is that all supplements within the 10% or an individual supplement? And we go back. Well, if I take Chris's, it might take the negative. Yeah. Is the 10% maximum on the supplements on the level of funding the LA receive, or after they have taken their retention?
So that's after they've taken their retention. So that's 10% of the money that they're giving to local providers. So once they've got their bit, they then have to channel the rest through, and 10% of that can be supplements.
So extending that, I think from Lorna's point of view, that is the same question, as much as the supplements apply to the 90% bit that they are then going to allocate out to 93%.
Yeah. Lorna, I hope that answers your question, because I think it might have related to a previous slide. If not, please retype if it hasn't, but hopefully that has answered your question. Yeah.
It's one of the interesting things when I've been travelling around visiting member settings and local authorities, the rural and sparsity issue is a major concern. There is a sense in some rural areas that actually the entire funding mechanism sort of pre-assumes high density metropolitan areas, and I think there's almost that concern that yes, you can reflect rurality and sparsity, but only within the money we'll give you as the national framework, rather than there being any extra money. I think that's going to be something that runs and runs.
Lorna, I can see that did answer your question, so that's brilliant, and thank you very much for letting us know. So that's the structure that local authorities have to work with, and they only had that confirmed in December. So for them, it's now a bit of a rush to implement their own local funding formulas. Unsurprisingly, they have to implement them by April because that's when they come into effect. They have to consult meaningfully with providers. Now, I've been speaking to a lot of providers where the word meaningfully seems to have been stretched to its maximum limit. I know some people that got an email popped to them before Christmas to say, what do you think of this? And then after Christmas got told that was the consultation. You should be being consulted meaningfully on the changes and proposals, and schools forums must be consulted on changes to local formulas by the end of February. I know at the moment there is a lot of people that don't know what their local formula is going to be or don't know what's being proposed. We are in my team working on trying to compile this information with a view to making it available. As you can imagine, 152 local authorities, all with different levels of transparency and preparedness. It's not the easiest thing in the world, but we are doing our best on that. So this one I think is quite an important one. It's something that has come up a lot. There's been a common misconception where, and it's a really understandable one, the government has said that local authorities will get a minimum funding rate of £4.30 an hour. The government has also said that local authorities have to pass on 93% of the funding they receive to providers. Therefore, people understandably said, okay, so the minimum funding that I'm going to get from my local authority is £4 an hour. And then they get a consultation from their local authority suggesting a completely different figure, and something's gone totally wrong with that. So I'm going to try and explain as clearly but as briefly as possible why that is. So if you've received those questions, then those figures from your local authority suggesting you're getting £3.80, you understand why.
And I think at the time, Karen's just put a note in saying that she's got a schools forum meeting tomorrow night, where this is obviously the prime topic for the agenda. And those sorts of assumptions there and misconceptions will no doubt be common, I would imagine.
Definitely. So what the government consultation response document says is every local authority will receive a minimum funding rate of at least £4.30 an hour. This will give local authorities the scope to pay providers an average funding rate of at least £4 per hour. The key thing to recognise there is average funding rate. It doesn't mean that everybody in the local authority will receive £4 an hour. It means when you average what people are receiving, they'll receive £4 an hour on average. So I'm going to try and explain that. Don't get scared by the table, please. Using an example kind of extracted from, it's a fake example extracted from a real local authority. I wasn't sure if Micah had a question, so I paused just in case.
And I think one of the extensions of that misconception is the understandable one that all providers will receive the same hourly rate as a result of this, and that is by definition this not going to be the case.
Exactly. So this hopefully will give you a good example of a made-up local authority who has a base rate of £4.55 per hour, and they've got some supplements. They've got deprivation, they've got quality, and they've got flexibility, 34p, 15p and 10p respectively. Now if we pretend for this local authority that the total amount of funding they get from government for the 3 and 4-year-olds offer is £4.7 million a year, and the total hours of the 3 and 4-year-old offer that are delivered in that local authority is 1 million. You can tell I've tried to kind of round these numbers nicely. To work out the average funding rate, that means on average the local authority is spending £4.70. So this is money that local authority is giving to providers. On average, £4.70 an hour. So we would say the average funding rate in that area for providers is £4.70 an hour. That's how you get to that figure. Now in our example, if we say the funding rate that that local authority receives from central government is £5.05, then we would say, okay, so what is £4.70 as a proportion of £5.05? And when we work that out, it's 93%. So we're saying, okay, they're on the edge, but that local authority is adhering to that rule. They receive £5.05 from government, they've passed on 93% of it on average to providers. But if you're a provider that, for whatever reason, doesn't get a deprivation supplement, doesn't get a quality supplement, and doesn't get a flexibility supplement, you're only getting the base rate of £4.55. So you might look at that and say, well, hang on, if I calculate £4.55 as a percentage of £5.05, that doesn't come up to 93%, it comes up to about 90%. They're not following the rule, but they are, because on average they're passing on 93%. So that's why the confusion has arisen. Supplements have played a big part. The average rate includes supplements. So if you're just looking at the base rate, it might not hit 93%.
So which bits of that calculation do the local authority have to put in the public domain?
In terms of the 93%?
Presumably they would have to publish what they get from central government.
Mm-hmm.
They would
have to publish essentially the equivalent of this table, so what the base rate is.
Right.
They don't really need to explain to providers how they're making 93%.
I was going to say, they wouldn't necessarily say how many hours there are for 3 and 4-year-olds in their area.
But they would in their returns to government. So their Section 251 returns, that's where they would be called out. If they have to say to government every year, this is how much we've spent, this is how many hours, and it's a form that this table on the left is an extracted part of that form. It's a massive form with lovely colours, where they have to break down the total amount of funding, total amount of hours, what that breaks down to in terms of base rate and supplement. So it's there that if they're not following that 93% rule, government will spot that they're not, because they have to file those returns to government.
At the end of the year.
At the end of the year, exactly. I mean, if you had a rebel local authority that decided to try and get away with it till the end of the year, I feel that they're
just reassuringly, Karen's put note, one of the areas in which she works shared all the information and used the same format as Shannon to calculate. So there you go.
That's very reassuring. Thank you. So hopefully that makes sense and kind of clears up any confusion on that point. It's also worth noting that we've talked about supplements and how supplements are included in that kind of 93% calculation. There are also a couple of other bits that are included in the 93% calculation that you should be aware of, because it could come up in your local consultation. That is contingency spend. So local authorities are allowed to hold some money back for contingency. Someone on the phone to me this week referred to it as rainy day money, money that they hold back just in case it's needed later on. And that's included in the 93%. So that counts as money being spent on providers. And another one which has come up is a bit of a surprise, and I know Michael's team have been looking into this as well, is SEN inclusion funding. We are going to go on to this in a bit more detail, so I don't want to kind of preempt it, but essentially money for a new pot of funding referred to as SEN inclusion funding counts as money being spent on providers, so it counts in that 93%. So it means that if your local authority is taken a chunk of money out of your early years funding pot to spend on SEN inclusion funding, this isn't in addition to your funding rate. It will probably impact your funding rate and bring the base rate down. And I'm going to go on to speak about that a bit more.
Question from Sally, who's quick off the mark. Is there a limit on the size of the contingency funding?
There is not, no.
So that, as well as an argument from a local authority that we need to make lots of provision for special educational needs, could be taking a sizable whack out of the 93%.
I think the figures that we had before when we were looking at contingency spending for the last published data, which is 2015-16, was about 3.7% on average. But we double-checked with the DfE, and while there is a limit on central spend, there is no limit on contingency spending. As far as I'm aware, there haven't been many complaints from providers about an excessive use of contingency spend as there have been on the central spend, but that may well be because people aren't so aware of it as a source of spending. So I will move on to SEND support, so I can talk a bit more about that inclusion funding as well. So there are two main proposals that the government has made and have confirmed they are continuing with to improve support for SEND provision. SEN inclusion funds and disability access funding. So SEN inclusion funds, these are essentially pots of money that all local authorities now have to do. Before the consultation, it wasn't quite clear if it was going to be compulsory or not. It is compulsory. And they're pots of money that are supposed to provide greater clarity on where funding for children with lower level or emerging SEN needs can be found. So the idea is that if a child has higher level SEN needs, their funding should be able to be topped up by the high needs funding pot. That is not always the case, but this is the theory that the government is working with. So just as a bit of background, because I remember someone asking me this last webinar, when we're talking about education funding, it's split into 3 pots. So each local authority has a pot of education money, and that's split into 3 mini pots, one for schools, one for early years, and one for high needs, which covers children in early years and in schools. So what the government has said is that all local authorities should take some money from their high needs pot and/or take some money from their early years pot and put it in what's called an SEN inclusion fund. And that means that providers will know where to get money to support children with lower level SEN. So they've suggested children receiving SEN support. The issue is, and what is, has been raised to us, is some providers who have, local authorities, who have previously relied on their high needs pot for SEN support have said, great, we can save the high needs pot, we're going to take that money from the early years pot. And they shifted it wholesale and taken all their money for their inclusion fund from their early years funding pot, which has made their base rate for everyone decrease quite significantly. It's an issue that we are and have raised to the DFE and are in discussions with them on, but it's just something to be aware of as you're getting your local rates, that if your local authority has used the early years funding pot for its SEN inclusion fund, it will have an impact on your base rate. Disability access funding, we've touched on a little bit before. So as we said, £12.5 million paid to providers for children that are in receipt of the disability living allowance and also in receipt of the free entitlement. It's paid as an annual sum, £615 a year, and providers are responsible for deciding how it's spent. Just a few technical issues just so that you're aware. The government has said in its guidance that if a child is eligible for disability access funding and is splitting their free entitlement across 2 or more providers, local authorities are meant to ask parents to nominate the main setting, and that's where the money will get paid. And if a child is receiving disability access funding and they move from one setting to another within a financial year, the money won't be recouped from the first setting, and the second setting, the new setting, will not be eligible to receive disability access funding in that financial year. So that is something you should be aware of if you do have children that are eligible.
So is the money paid at the beginning? That last bullet point implies that the money is paid up front.
Yes, so it's a total
which
annual
is unusual,
sum. Yeah.
Because most local authority, I'm thinking pupil premium, for example, the issue is often that the money doesn't actually get to the provider until those pesky children have left and gone to school.
I know that there were some responses to the consultation that were worried about how the practicality of the payment of disability access funding would work. I think the government kind of like, yeah, once a year, big lump sum, and people said it won't work, it might not work that easily, and the earliest people premium has had real issues with how the money is paid. And in their consultation response, they said they will look at it before the rollout to make sure that it's done. Whether that fills you with confidence, I don't know, but they have said it. So this slide is it's one we used in the last webinar. It might look a bit complicated, but it essentially just shows you how the early years and high needs block, which is part of the dedicated schools grant, so that's just what the education funding pot is called, how the early years and high needs pot can both be used to fund the inclusion fund. The high needs pot can also be used to fund children with high level SEN, so those misstatements for education, health and care plans. And it can also be used to help children with disabilities in receipt of the DLA, as can disability access funding. So it's just a summary of the different sources and who they're meant to go to and where they come from.
You get the sense that complexity in the system isn't going to facilitate ease of access.
No, it doesn't feel with the most confidence that it's going to be a smooth and problem-free process, but that's an overview essentially. In the interest of time, and in case there are any questions at the end as well, we're going to whiz on to the delivery side of things, the practical side of things. So a quick update or reminder about eligibility criteria. So it's been confirmed, it's not changed as it's been for a little while now. The minimum earnings for a parent to be eligible for 30 hours is the equivalent of 16 hours per week at national minimum living wage. So if a person is receiving the living wage, that would be about £120 a week. And if they were, say, 21 to 24 and they're receiving the minimum wage for 21 to 24-year-olds, it would be about £112, £113 a week. The key thing here is it's not hours worked, it's money earned. So it doesn't matter if someone's working 16 hours or 10 hours. If they're earning equal to or more than the equivalent of 16 hours a week at national minimum living wage, they are eligible, and obviously that will change as the national minimum wage increase year on year. And the maximum earnings is £100,000 per year each if it's a dual parent family. So parents were earning just under £200,000 a year for the household are still eligible for 30 hours. Because we're limited for time, I won't get into what I think about that. Take from my tone what you will. So it's also important to note that parents will be eligible if they are self-employed on 0-hour contracts or on sick and parental leave and would normally be meeting the criteria on the previous slide, or are disabled or have substantial care responsibility if their partner is employed. Just a few queries that came up when we were putting a call out for questions. What happens when parents are separated? In those instances, eligibility applies to the parent with whom the child normally lives, that's direct quote. And where a parent has a partner, so not the parent of the child, not another parent of the child, but the parent's spouse, someone they have a civil partnership with or who they live with, the eligibility criteria does also apply to that partner, even though that partner isn't a biological parent of the child. So that's important to note when you're talking to parents about eligibility. If they live with someone who's, say, a new partner, that person does also need to meet that eligibility criteria because the government's looking at household income.
Oh, as you say, that's interesting because it's a tax-related element, but the tax, just with people who are cohabiting, tax does not deal at that level, does it? That's really quite interesting, how they would check that.
It's a very interesting one. It's very telling of the back to work agenda that's like, I don't care if you're living with someone, they have to meet it too. So in terms of how we work out if parents are eligible, it's up to parents to apply for the scheme. It's an application scheme, it's a dual application scheme that will double up with the tax-free childcare scheme, and it's being developed by HMRC and includes an eligibility checking system, which I bet will work perfectly fine with no glitches or flaws whatsoever. If parents provide false information about their eligibility, they can be fined between £300 and £3,000. So in terms of a practical sense, parents have to go onto the HMRC website. They put in their information to prove that they're eligible for the 30 hours and tax-free childcare offer because the eligibility criteria is the same for both. And they're given a code which they are to present to their chosen provider or providers. The provider then uses the same glitch-free eligibility system to check that that code is valid. And if it is, they can either book a place for the child at their setting, or they can refer the parent back to the local authority if they say, no, we don't have any room. And it's up to parents to reconfirm their eligibility online every 3 months.
And what if they don't?
Then they no longer have a valid code for the provider, so cannot get the place.
So if a parent fails to update that information every 3 months, ultimately it's the provider who does not receive the money for their 30 hours, even though they've continued to provide it.
So the money should, the provider should be receiving money for the 30 hours that they've provided.
Yeah.
Because we're going to have a monthly payment system going forward. So the provider shouldn't miss out on, which we haven't got to yet, but so it shouldn't.
So it's in the provider's interest to make sure that parents continue to reconfirm their eligibility.
Exactly, it is exactly. So in any kind of materials that you're producing for parents, it's worth flagging that up to them. As far as I'm aware, although it might happen in advance of September, that hasn't been highlighted particularly.
I think Lorna's ahead of you because I'm sure it will come up. Won't the parent go into a grace period at the end of that and the provider can stop delivering the 30 hours? The grace period, as far as I'm aware, refers to no longer being employed.
That's correct, yeah.
Does it also apply to an idle parent who has not gone on the website to reconfirm their eligibility?
The government hasn't confirmed that. To me, it would make sense because you can imagine how many parents there would be that would just simply forget to do so, and it wouldn't make sense that the next day they've no longer got 30 hours. The government hasn't confirmed that in its guidance, but in terms of the grace period, Lorna, it is coming up on literally the next slide, so bear with me. So in terms of change in circumstances, if a parent, for example, increases their hours, gets a new job, and they become eligible for the 30-hour offer, local authorities are expected to find a place as soon as is reasonably practicable and no later than the start of the next term. If parents become ineligible for the 30-hour offer, local authorities are required to continue finding their place for a grace period. The actual length of the grace period has not been confirmed yet. The government said in its consultation response that it was going to talk to providers and networks, not via a formal consultation, just kind of informally, and produce a national grace period. It's not been confirmed yet. And Lorna, in answer to your question, I would imagine that would also apply to parents who've just not filled out the form, but that has not been confirmed by DfE.
Technical thing, Karen's asked a question. Will you be able to do this manually? She's referring to the updating for those who without online facilities. Does the whole thing assume?
It's a really good question. All the government has said is this eligibility checking system by HMRC. They haven't talked about an offline version of it. It's a question I'm happy to take back to the DfE because it is a very good one, because obviously there are many parents and some providers who don't have easy web access, so it's an important one to ask. So I will take that back and double check for you, Karen. So just on to delivery, we're starting to come to a close now if you're starting to feel a little bit weary. Sounds obvious, but it's worth stating that providers do not have to offer the 30 hours if they don't want to. They can continue to offer the 15 hours and just choose not to extend to 30 hours, and they will continue to get their funding. Funding rates for the 15 and 30 hours are exactly the same, so it shouldn't make any difference to your funding. Providers can offer the extended entitlement in part. So, for example, I've had some sessional preschools say we only open for 25 hours a week. Can we still technically do the 30-hour offer and get the funding? Yes, you can. The DfE have confirmed. And parents don't have to take up the full 30 hours. So if a parent says, well, I only want to take up 25 hours, does that count? Yes, it does. They don't have to take up the full 30 hours to get the additional funding. It's not a choice between 15 or 30 only. It can fall somewhere in between. So in terms of the delivery of the 30 hours, in terms of flexibility, in terms of how many weeks over the year, like the 15 hours, 30 hours assumes a 38-week year. And what the parent is actually entitled to is 1,140 hours per year. So if a provider chooses to extend that offer, say to 48 weeks of the year, just under 24 hours per week, that's absolutely fine. As long as it's the 1,140 a year, they can do the stretched offer, and the government is actually pro-stretched offer. A question that has come up to me about 6 times in the past week is, what about less than 38 weeks of the year? You can offer the 30-hour offer over less than 38 weeks of the year. There is some guidance the DfE has put out that makes it seem like you can't. You can. It's really poorly worded guidance. I've confirmed with them about 4 times just to make sure. Essentially what it is you can't offer more than 30 hours a week funded. So if, for example, you are open for 34 weeks of the year and a parent takes up 30 hours per week, that parent is getting 1,020 hours a year. So they're not getting the full 1,140 hours. By taking up your provision, they are giving up their right to those extra hours. So any provider that is offering less than 38 weeks of the year just has to let the parent know you can take up 30 hours a week, but you actually won't get the full annual allowance that you're entitled to. And if the parent is happy with that, that's absolutely fine.
But they can't have 35 hours.
Well, they can, but they'd be paying for those extra hours.
No, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
The system, the free entitlement system, does not allow you to, a parent to have more than 30 hours in any given week.
Exactly. The other couple of points quickly is about funded sessions and when they can start and when they can end. It used to be that the earliest a funded session could start was 7 a.m. and separately the latest it could start was 7 p.m. They've now changed that, so the earliest a funded session can start is 6 a.m. and the latest it can finish is 8 p.m. But you could not run a session from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. because there is still a maximum session length of 10 hours. So if you started at 6 a.m., you'd have to finish by 4. And if you were going to finish by 8, you'd have to start at 10. So the actual maximum length is still the same at 10 hours, and there is no minimum anymore. And in terms of...
Just one thing in terms of flexibility, again, the question, can a provider also work in partnership to offer the full offer with other providers in the area? So a preschool that only does term time could work with a day nursery that does all year round, etc.
My understanding from the DfE is yes, that's absolutely fine. Their partnerships are encouraged. It's just if they're taking their offer solely with you, they wouldn't be able to because they wouldn't be able to get their full hours. But that they wouldn't be able to do that with you as a loan provider. Obviously, if they wanted to take their additional hours elsewhere, that would be no problem. And the government has said that children can take up the free entitlement in a maximum of 2 sites per day. That's the only limit. So if a child was taking up 2 sites per day, but then changed 4 times in the year, there's no government guidance against that. The government has said that providers and parents should be aware of the impact of the child, the changing providers, but there's no guidance or anything other than 2 sites per day. There was a question that I'm going to take to the DfE that someone picked up on the word sites and said, well, if there's 2 different settings that are located on the same site, does that count as, what do we mean by site? Can they switch between settings on the same site and that just counts as the same 1 site per day? It's a little bit complicated, but take it as there's only a daily maximum on the amount of providers a child can use. There's no monthly or yearly. So we're coming to an end now. Just a quick note on the delivery model. The government is going to introduce a standardised model agreement template to mitigate the fact that different local authorities have different agreements and in different areas, and particularly for providers that operate across multiple areas, that can be a real sticking point. That's expected to be produced in the next few months. And all councils will be expected to pay providers on a monthly basis by September 2018, not 17, it's quite important to note that, 18, unless providers in the area say you don't want a monthly basis and they request an alternative payment frequency.
I've got an interesting one for Christine. When offering hours to parents, can you only offer 15 hours and then charge for anything over 15 hours, even if the family is eligible for the 30 hours?
Yes, you can, because
that's basically opting out.
You're opting out of the scheme. You do not have to offer 30 hours, so you're just not receiving additional funding. So if you say, I only offer 15 hours at this setting, if they're happy to, they can take those 15 hours funded and pay for it. The question is, would they be happy to, or would they prefer to seek 30 hours? But as long as they're happy to take it, that's absolutely fine. You're essentially just opting out of the 30 hours and sticking with the 15 hours, that's fine.
Right, and from Chris, I'm going to get you here. If a parent is using across 2 settings, is there a specification of who claims the 15 hours free entitlement and who claims the additional 15 hours of the extended free entitlement for events? Because if a family becomes ineligible, which setting loses their money for the extra 15 hours?
I think it's in our guide. It's another one where the parent is asked to nominate the main setting and to say, right, this is the main setting. So I think it's a similar situation. I will double check that. I have a feeling that was asked to us on Twitter, and I think it might be in the guide. I can flick just in case it's in there. But my understanding is it's a parent nomination. But Chris, I will make a note of that and double check just in there.
And just while Shannon is looking that up, it is, I think what you've highlighted there, Chris, is the point that is another of the misconceptions. We are not talking about 30 hours. We are talking about 2 lots of 15 hours. One 15 hours which is universal and you get by benefit of your child being 3 or 4, but the other 15 hours is an eligibility requirement in terms of there are factors which you have to demonstrate in order for your child to benefit from the extra 15 hours. And whilst it's a fascinating technical question you've got, I reckon this will come up in due course about who's getting the free bit, the entitlement bit, and who's getting the extra 15 hours. In some ways, this will become an issue.
The point that I was looking at in the guide is a slightly separate point about if the parent wanted to continue to take up 15 hours. But I'll double check that, Chris, and get back to you via, hopefully follow us on Twitter or Facebook so we can post something on there. I can see Lorna asked about different providers on each day of the week. Technically, Lorna, yes, they could. That was the point I was trying to make, where the only limit is on how many sites the child accesses per day. That's the only limit that the government was putting on. They're not putting on any additional limits on that. They do say that there needs to be an awareness of what's in the best interest of the child.
As Lorna indicates in her parentheses of not sure why they want to, we would argue that isn't in the best interest of children.
Exactly, but technically, yes.
Jackie has come, I cannot provide 30 hours, but can I extend to 40 weeks, which will enable me to provide 1,140 hours per year?
Yeah, so the entitlement is called 30 hours, but it is an entitlement for 1,140 hours per year. So if you want to offer that stretched over 40 weeks, so less hours per week, but more weeks, that's absolutely fine if you've got parents who are happy to do that.
You're exactly the type of provider that the DFE likes here, Jackie. One of the issues that becomes a practical one, however, is many providers are not in accommodation, which allows them to automatically extend their number of weeks or to extend the number of hours in the day because it's a community premises and there are other users on those premises at the other time. So that's exactly the sentiment that DFE is looking to encourage by this, and hopefully your circumstance will allow you to do it.
Yeah. Just in answer, sorry, to Chris's question, I realised that I think what's in the guide does actually answer that second half of his question, so I'm just going to quickly read it. Chris, I hope it does. If it doesn't, I will hope that you'll reiterate your question and let me know if it doesn't. So what the government has told us is any child who is no longer eligible for the 30-hour offer will still be eligible for the universal 15-hour free entitlement offer if they had previously been taking up their 30-hour place at more than one provider. Their parent can choose the provider they want to continue to take their 15-hour place with, or continue to split their 15-hour entitlement between these providers. So it's very much parental choice. I hope that to some extent answers your question, but please do let me know if not.
So they could end up with 7.5 hours.
It's a foolproof financial model for sustainability. Coming to an end here, I almost dare bring up this slide because we've only got a few minutes left, and I can imagine it opening up a can of worms. But in terms of additional charges, the official rules from the government are you can charge for things that fall outside what you receive funding for. So consumable items such as nappies and additional services such as trips. You cannot make them a condition of taking up a funded place. So if a parent comes to you and says, I want my 30 hours, and you say, okay, but we charge for lunch, and they say, no, I'm going to send my child in with a packed lunch. You cannot say to them, you can only take up this place if you buy lunches. They have to have the option of taking up the 30 hours. Now, I know there's a lot of discussion, a lot of debate about that. This is just literally to give you the rules as they are given to us by the DfE, so you're aware of them. One question that was raised to us was about things like trips. If you've got a child who's taken up just their free entitlement and their parent has decided, well, I'm not paying for the extra trips, what happens to that child when everybody else is on a trip? All the DfE said was that they expect providers to ensure that children are not disadvantaged if their parents choose not to purchase additional services. It's very vague guidance, but that's what they gave us. It's also stated that providers should not charge deposit for funded places.
Emma has just asked a question. Is an admin fee charged to secure a place at a community preschool considered a deposit?
I would have to know more details about it. I can only say that if it was saying that you have to pay this money to secure this free place, it well could be. It's probably something you'd have to speak to your local authority about, because without knowing what the details of the agreement are and how it's worded to parents, it's difficult to kind of say, yes, that's a deposit, no, it's not. So depending on when it has to be paid by, if the place is dependent on it, the child can't start until you paid it, that would change that. So it's probably worth checking with your local authority on that then. So coming right to the end now, so just looking at what's coming up next. Local authorities should be consulting with providers to finalise funding formulas, and that template model agreement and statutory guidance is going to be published shortly. In April, the new funding formula comes in and everybody starts to receive their new funding rates, and local authorities will be restricted to 7% as central spend.
And correct me if I'm wrong, that funding rate is applied from April to the existing 15 hours.
Yes, so the funding rate applies across all free entitlement hours for 3 and 4 year olds. There's no two-tier system where 15 hours gets you this and 30 hours gets you that.
So are we looking at a situation where actually from April through until September, there could be a bit of an enhanced funding rate for providers at the moment, because they're not required yet to move to the extra 30 hours, but they are getting an enhanced rate at the new level for the 15 hours they currently operate?
Yeah, assuming the provider is indeed getting an enhanced rate. The funding rate for the 15 hours comes in April, so unless you're in a trial area and you're offering 30 hours, that rate would apply to 15 hours up until September, and then if you choose to extend to 30 hours, it will then apply across the entire 30 hours. And then in September, we have the 30-hour offer. In April next year, the central spend limit goes down to 5%. And by 2019, all local authorities are required to move to a universal base rate.
In classic form, Christine has asked the question which we could spend the next 3 hours talking about. Can the number of 30-hour places offered to be limited to, for example, 5 families per setting? Although who knows how you would decide who goes those to. This, not only is the answer is a yes to that seems to be, from my conversations with providers and local authorities, that seems to be exactly how many settings are doing their forward planning.
Yeah.
They've worked out that actually, in order to remain viable, at the rate I now think I'm going to get from the local authority, I'm a 50-place nursery, but actually I can only offer 10 additional 15-hour entitlement places. That's what they then go to the local authority, who really, understanding the circumstance of the setting, aren't in any position to say, well, that's terrible, you need to offer 50 places. So that is happening, and then the question you've alluded to is how do you decide which 10 families you go for? You could take the ethical route and say, well, I'll provide it to children from disadvantaged backgrounds because all the research demonstrates that those are the children who would benefit more from high quality early years provision. Or you could offer it to the 10 parents who you know are also going to pay the additional charge for services for which you're going to make it viable. I think it really is going to set some difficult moral questions, Christine, about how this actually operates in practice, and also it creates a political problem for the sector and for government that what you've said there is no longer an entitlement. It's not all 50 parents in that who currently access that setting who can then have their increased entitlement. You're only limiting it to 10. Where's the entitlement in that?
I think further to that point that Michael's made, you may have seen last week, this week, that we put a piece of research out that was undertaken by research company CEDA on the amount of places available, and the estimate was about 500,000 children will be eligible for the 30-hour offer, which is about 28% more than the government's estimate, which is 390,000. And one of the points we made is that increasingly providers are saying they're going to limit the amount of places that they're offering. So there's more people, there's more children eligible than the government thought there would be. And in addition to that, many providers who they assumed would just open their doors and offer 30 hours to everyone are actually saying, no, I'm only going to offer 4 or 5 places, so it's a real issue. In terms of queries, in terms of copies of slides, I know that the actual webinar will be made available online on our YouTube channel. If you just literally want the PowerPoint presentation, that's absolutely fine. Again, if you email feedback@pre-school.org.uk, I can actually send you the PowerPoint so you can just print out the slides a bit more easily. That's no problem whatsoever. We are coming right to the end, thank goodness, because there's right at time. There's more information. You can tell there's a wind down coming. So essentially we have a completely free guide to earliest funding and delivery changes that you can either order in hard copy or download as a PDF. You can see the URL just there, so it's just our website /EY guide. And a very quick plug at the end for our Fair Future Funding campaign. If you are worried about funding rates, please, please, please sign up to the campaign and encourage as many people as you can to sign up. Do not sign one name to represent the setting. What happens is when we speak to government, they say to us, is this really a big problem, or is it just a few people? And we need the evidence to say to them, no, it's a large-scale problem, so every signature counts. So if you haven't signed up, please do, and if you have, share it with everyone you know. And we made it just in time.
well done. Thank you, Shannon. That's tremendous. We've covered an awful lot of ground in there, and I think the questions that have come through have reflected the engagement that providers are now getting in their traction, their understanding in terms of what the implications are for this coming through and what their planning is. And the other thing that we're often genuinely surprised at is one of the things when you're planning your budgets now is you've got to know your parents. From the people who are currently accessing your setting or those who you think will be on your waiting list, do you know if their households are going to be eligible for the 30 hours? It's one of the things, it really is, the onus is on us to try and get, if we're going to do business planning sensibly to navigate through this effectively, we actually need to know who our parents are. In the past, with 15 hours, just the fact that the child was 3 or 4 years old, we knew tick the box. We now need to sensitively find out more information, because otherwise we're planning with a piece of string in the wind. That's me waffling on for a bit while anybody else is desperately typing any final questions they've got. We've had a few thank yous, and I would like to pass those on to Shannon for making something which is hugely complex very accessible, and I hope everybody has stayed with us. If not, as I say, by the end of the week, this will be available to download on the website, and you can enjoy it all over again. And then if you have any questions, send them to Shannon. Nothing more for me to say. I hope you found it as enjoyable and as informative as I have. Thank you, Shannon. I'll speak to you all very soon.
Thank you very much, John.
Bye-bye.